Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we're exploring a story that's been whispered about in margins and mentioned in passing, the lives of men who found themselves kept, cherished, and sometimes trapped by those who held power over them. Before we settle in together, if you enjoy what we do here, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you some peace. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something wonderful about imagining all of you, scattered across time zones, finding rest in these same old stories. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let's drift back to a time when love, power, and survival intertwined in ways both tender and complex. History tends to focus on the mistresses, those women who captured the hearts and purses of powerful men. But tonight, we turn our attention to their shadows, their counterparts, the kept men. These were not the swaggering lovers of romance novels, but rather complex figures, caught between affection and dependency, between genuine care and calculated survival. Picture, if you will, the soft rustle of silk against marble floors, the gentle clink of gold coins in velvet pouches, the whispered conversations behind heavy curtains. These men moved through gilded chambers and moonlit gardens, their lives a delicate balance of comfort and uncertainty, of being cherished and being owned. Verse 1, the Roman garden, a freedman's tender servitude. The morning light filters through the olive trees in Marcus Aurelius Gratianus's villa, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured paths. It's the second hour after dawn, and already the air carries the scent of rosemary and lavender from the herb garden that Alexios tends with such careful attention. Alexios moves between the planted rows with the practiced grace of someone who has learned to make every gesture pleasing. His hands, soft from oils and care, brush against the tender leaves of the mint plants his patron so loves in her evening wine. He is 26 now, though he looks younger, something that once served him well in the slave markets of Rhodes, and serves him still in the private chambers of this villa, overlooking the Bay of Naples. The villa itself breathes wealth in every carefully chosen detail. The peristyle garden, where Alexios spends his mornings, stretches 40 feet in each direction, surrounded by columns of Carrara marble that gleam like moonlight, even in the harsh Mediterranean sun. The fountain at its center, carved by an artist whose name has been lost to time, depicts dolphins at play, a reminder of the sea that brought both master and servant to this place. But it is not the master of the house who owns Alexius's attention. Marcus Aurelius Gratianus died 3 years ago, leaving behind a widow whose grief transformed into something more complex, a need for beauty, for youth, for the illusion that time might move backward if the right person whispered the right words in the darkness. Claudia Maxima is 52, though she tells visitors she is 45. She has buried 2 husbands and raised 3 children to adulthood, sent them off to manage estates and make marriages that strengthen the family name. In the empty spaces left behind, she has found Alexios, or rather, she has kept him, as one might keep a songbird whose melodies make the lonely hours bearable. The arrangement began with pragmatism, as these things often do. Alexios had been trained as a secretary, his Greek education making him valuable for correspondence with the eastern provinces. But his true gift lay in his ability to listen, to nod at the right moments, to offer comfort without judgment. In the months after her husband's death, when Claudia found herself wandering the villa at night, unable to sleep, Alexios would read to her from the philosophers Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, the gentle Stoics who promised that suffering was temporary and wisdom eternal. Gradually, reading became conversation. Conversation became companionship. Companionship became something more tender and more complicated. Now, as Alexios moves through the morning garden, he carries with him the weight of the previous night's whispered confessions. Claudia had spoken of her fear of growing old alone, of the way her children's visits had become dutiful rather than loving. of how the city's other widows seemed to watch her with a mixture of pity and envy. He had held her hand in the darkness, his thumb tracing the lines of her palm, and promised that he would remain as long as she needed him. The promise was both gift and chain. Alexios is technically free, had arranged his manumission papers within a year of acquiring him. But freedom, he has learned, is more complex than legal documents. Where would he go? What would he do? His skills are ornamental, his education designed to please rather than to achieve independence. He speaks Greek like a scholar and Latin like a gentleman, but he has never handled accounts or managed property. He knows the names of flowers and the proper way to arrange them in a vase, but he has never planted a field or negotiated a contract. The garden around him is beautiful, precisely because it is artificial, every plant chosen for its color or scent, every path designed to create the illusion of natural wilderness, while remaining perfectly controlled. In many ways, Alexios realizes he has become part of this careful artifice. He is the human element that completes the aesthetic, the living ornament that makes the widow's solitude bearable. As the sun climbs higher, servants begin their daily routines around him. The kitchen slaves prepare Claudia's morning meal figs and honey, wine mixed with warm water, bread that has been baked to a golden softness. The house slaves sweep the marble floors and arrange fresh flowers in the atrium. Everyone moves with the quiet efficiency of a well-managed household, but Alexios notices how their eyes avoid his. He occupies a space that makes them uncomfortable higher than a slave, lower than family, neither servant nor master. He remembers the first time Claudia introduced him to visitors as her dear friend. The words had hung in the air like incense, sweet and heavy with implications. The guests had smiled and nodded, but he had seen the quick exchange of glances, the raised eyebrows, the way conversation shifted slightly, as if his presence had altered the social atmosphere of the room. But there are compensations. His rooms are in the guest wing, furnished with a proper bed instead of a sleeping mat, with a small brazier for cool evenings, and a writing desk where he composes letters for Claudia's correspondence. He wears tunics of fine linen, not the rough wool of working men, and his meals are prepared by the same cook who serves the family. When Claudia travels to her estates in the countryside, he accompanies her in the same litter, sharing the cushioned interior and the view of the passing landscape. The afternoons are perhaps the most peaceful. After the midday meal, when the household retreats from the heat, Alexios often finds himself in the library with Claudia. The room is cool and dim, its walls lined with scrolls and codices that represent generations of learning. They might discuss philosophy, or she might ask him to read poetry aloud Ovid's Transformations, Catulus's Passions, the gentle verses of Tibullus, who wrote so beautifully about love and loss. Sometimes in these quiet moments, Alexios forgets the complexity of his situation. Claudia is genuinely intelligent, well-read, curious about the world beyond the villa's walls. Their conversations range from the practical how to manage difficult tenants, whether to expand the vineyards, to the philosophical. She seeks his opinion on matters of beauty and taste, and he finds himself genuinely engaged, offering thoughts that emerge from real consideration rather than mere flattery. But always, beneath the intellectual companionship, runs the current of their more intimate connection. Claudia's hand might rest on his shoulder as she leans over to examine a passage in a book. Her fingers might brush his as she takes a wine cup from his hands. These small touches are both casual and charged, gestures that speak of comfort and familiarity while maintaining the fiction that their relationship is primarily one of friendship. The evenings are when the illusion becomes most transparent. After the household has retired, Claudia often summons Alexios to her chambers. Sometimes she genuinely needs his help, a letter to dictate, a decision to discuss, a passage from a book she wishes to hear again. But more often, she simply wants his presence, his quiet attention, his assurance that she is not alone in the vast emptiness of the villa. He has learned to read her moods, to know when she needs conversation and when she prefers silence. On nights when melancholy settles over her like a cloak, he might massage her temples with oil scented with lavender, his fingers working gently until the tension leaves her face. On evenings when she feels restless, he might suggest a walk through the moonlit garden, where the night-blooming jasmine releases its perfume into the cool air. Their physical intimacy, when it occurs, is gentle and careful, more about comfort than passion, more about the human need for touch than about desire. Claudia approaches these moments with a tenderness that suggests she understands the delicate balance of their arrangement. She is neither demanding nor possessive, but rather grateful, as if she recognizes that what Alexios offers is both precious and fragile. Yet even in these most private moments, Alexios remains aware of the performance aspect of his role. He must be attentive, but not overwhelming, passionate, but not presumptuous, devoted, but not possessive. He has learned to give pleasure while concealing his own needs, to offer comfort while maintaining the illusion that he requires nothing in return. The truth, which he admits only to himself in the quietest hours before dawn, is more complex. He has grown genuinely fond of Claudia, appreciative of her intelligence and her kindness. The villa has become home in a way that no place ever was during his years of slavery. The routines of their days together provide a structure that feels almost like family, almost like belonging. But beneath the affection runs a current of uncertainty that never quite disappears. What happens when Claudia ages beyond the desire for companionship? What happens if she remarries, or if her children decide that his presence is no longer appropriate? What happens if he himself grows tired of the careful balance, the constant awareness of his dependence? These questions follow him through the garden paths as he continues his morning rounds. The roses need pruning, the fountain requires cleaning, the herb garden must be watered before the sun grows too strong. Each task is performed with the same careful attention, the same devotion to beauty and order that characterizes his entire existence. As the morning progresses toward noon, Alexios begins to prepare for Claudia's awakening. He selects flowers for her chamber-white lily for their scent, red roses for their color, sprigs of rosemary for their meaning. He reviews the day's schedule, the visitors who will call, the correspondence that requires attention. He ensures that everything is in place for another day of their carefully orchestrated life together. The sun climbs higher, casting shorter shadows in the garden. Soon, Claudia will emerge from her chambers, dressed in the soft colors she prefers, her hair arranged in the simple style that flatters her aging face. She will greet him with the same warm smile she offers every morning, as if his presence is both expected and welcomed, as if their arrangement is the most natural thing in the world. And Alexios will return her smile, offer his arm for support, and begin another day of being exactly what she needs him to be: companion, confidant, ornament, and comfort. The role that has become both his refuge and his prison, his salvation and his limitation, his home and his exile from the world beyond the villa's walls. Verse 2. The Polish Prince, Power's Golden Cage. The winter of 1762 settles over St. Petersburg like a heavy fur cloak, muffling the sounds of the city beneath layers of snow and ice. In the private apartments of the Winter Palace, where the new Empress Catherine holds court, the air is thick with the scent of burning wood and melting beeswax from hundreds of candles that push back the long Russian darkness. Stanislaw August Poniatowski moves through these gilded chambers with the careful grace of a man who has learned to navigate the treacherous currents of imperial favor. At 29, he possesses the kind of refined masculine beauty that stops conversations in doorways' dark eyes that seem to hold secrets. A mouth that suggests both intelligence and sensuality. Hands that gesture with the elegant precision of someone educated in the finest courts of Europe. But tonight, as he adjusts the emerald pin at his throat, a gift from Catherine. Herself, Poniatowski feels the weight of his position settling around him like chains made of gold and silk. He is the Empress's lover, her confidant, her most trusted advisor on matters both political and personal. He is also, though the word is never spoken aloud, her prisoner. The relationship had begun 3 years earlier, when Catherine was still the Grand Duchess, married to the weak and ineffectual Peter, heir to the Russian throne. Poniatowski had arrived in St. Petersburg as part of a diplomatic mission from Poland. A young nobleman whose family had pinned their hopes for advancement on his wit, his education, and his undeniable charm. Catherine had been drawn to him immediately, not just by his physical beauty, though that was considerable, but by his mind-sharp, cultured, capable of the kind of sophisticated conversation that her husband could never provide. In a court where intelligence was often viewed with suspicion, Poniatowski offered something rare, the ability to be both brilliant and deferential, to provide stimulation without threat. Their first conversations had taken place in the palace library, a vast room lined with books in French, German, and Russian. Catherine would summon him there, under the pretext of discussing Polish affairs. But their talks quickly ranged beyond politics to philosophy, literature, the arts. She was starved for intellectual companionship, and he was eager to please, to make himself indispensable. The physical relationship had developed with the same careful progression. A hand held slightly too long while examining a map. A brush of fingers while passing a letter. Meetings that extended later into the evening. Wine that loosened tongues and inhibitions. When Catherine finally invited him to her private chambers, the step felt both inevitable and momentous. But everything changed when Peter died, whether by assassination or accident. The truth remains buried in the winter ground outside St. Petersburg, and Catherine seized the throne. Suddenly, the young woman who had shared intimate conversations and stolen kisses became the Empress of all the Russias, wielder of absolute power, commander of armies and architect of policy. Poniatowski's position transformed overnight from romantic intrigue to political necessity. He was no longer simply Catherine's lover. He was her link to Poland, her instrument for influencing the politics of his homeland. Every conversation became a negotiation, every tender moment shadowed by questions of state. The apartments Catherine has provided for him are magnificent, a suite of rooms in the Winter Palace itself, furnished with the finest French and German craftsmanship. The bedroom features a bed draped in silk the color of sapphires, with sheets so fine they seem to flow like water. The sitting room is arranged for intimate conversations, with chairs placed before a fireplace that burns continuously through the harsh Russian winter. But luxury, Poniatowski has learned, can be its own form of imprisonment. The servants who attend him are Catherine's servants, reporting his movements, his visitors, his correspondence. The guards who protect him also watch him, ensuring that he remains where the Empress can find him when she needs him. His days follow a careful rhythm that has been shaped by Catherine's desires and demands. He rises late, as is customary for courtiers, and spends his mornings in correspondence. Letters arrive from Poland carrying news of his family, his estates, the complex political situation that threatens to tear his country apart. He must read these carefully, extracting information that might be useful to Catherine, while protecting sources and family members who depend on his discretion. The afternoons are often devoted to what Catherine calls their consultations, meetings where she seeks his advice on Polish affairs. These sessions take place in her private study, a room that manages to be both intimate and imposing. Catherine sits behind a desk of polished mahogany, documents spread before her like a general's battle plans. Poniatowski occupies a chair across from her, close enough to examine papers when she passes them to him, close enough to catch the scent of the French perfume she favors. These meetings reveal the complexity of his position. Catherine genuinely values his intelligence and his insight into Polish politics. She listens to his suggestions, asks probing questions, seeks his opinion on matters of strategy and diplomacy. But always, beneath the intellectual exchange, runs the current of their more intimate relationship. Her hand might rest on his, as she points to a passage in a document. Her eyes might linger on his face as he speaks. The conversation might shift from matters of state to personal reminiscences, shared memories of their earlier, less complicated time together. But Poniatowski has learned to read the signs that indicate when Catherine the woman is about to be subsumed by Catherine the Empress. A certain stiffening of her posture, a cooler tone in her voice, a way of looking at him that suggests she is calculating rather than simply enjoying his company. In these moments, he must adjust his own behavior, become more formal, more deferential, more aware of the vast gulf in power that separates them. The evenings are when their relationship comes closest to resembling what it once was. After the day's business is concluded, after the final audience has been granted and the last document signed, Catherine often summons Poniatowski to her private chambers. These rooms, which few people ever see, are decorated with the more personal touch paintings she has chosen herself, books she actually reads, small objects that hold sentimental value. Here, in the soft light of carefully placed candles, they can almost pretend they are still the Grand Duchess and the charming Polish diplomat. Two young people drawn together by mutual attraction and shared interests. Catherine might ask him to read to her from a favorite poet, or they might discuss a piece of music she has been learning to play. Their conversation ranges freely, touching on subjects that have nothing to do with politics or power. But even in these most private moments, Poniatowski remains aware of the performance aspect of his role. He must be attentive to Catherine's moods, responsive to her needs, capable of providing whatever form of companionship she requires. If she needs intellectual stimulation, he must be brilliant. If she needs emotional support, he must be tender. If she needs physical comfort, he must be passionate without being demanding. The physical aspects of their relationship have evolved as Catherine's position has solidified. What once felt like mutual desire now carries the weight of expectation and obligation. Poniatowski has learned to read her body language, to know when she needs the reassurance of physical intimacy and when she prefers the comfort of simple companionship. He has mastered the art of being available without being presumptuous, of offering pleasure while appearing to seek nothing in return. Yet beneath the careful choreography of their interactions, deeper currents run. Poniatowski has genuine feelings for Catherine, admiration for her intelligence, respect for her strength, even a form of love that has survived the transformation of their relationship. But these feelings are complicated by resentment, by the knowledge that his own life has been subordinated to her needs and desires. He thinks often of Poland, of the family estates he has not seen in 3 years, of the political career that might have been his if he had not become entangled in the web of Catherine's ambitions. Letters from home speak of opportunities missed, of other young men advancing in positions that might have been his. His younger brother has married and produced an heir, continuing the family line that Poniatowski himself seems unlikely to continue. For what future can he plan? Catherine shows no sign of tiring of his company, but neither does she offer any indication of what role he might play in her long-term plans. She has made him wealthy gifts of money and jewels arrive regularly, ensuring that he lacks for nothing material. But wealth without independence is merely comfortable dependency. The question of marriage looms particularly large in his thoughts. At nearly 30, he should be establishing his own household, producing heirs, building the kind of life that men at his station are expected to live. But how can he marry while bound to Catherine? What woman would accept a husband whose first loyalty must always be to another woman? What children could he raise when his own life is subject to the whims of an empress? These concerns weigh heavily on him as he prepares for another evening in Catherine's company. The ritual of preparation has become second nature, the careful attention to his appearance, the selection of clothing that flatters without appearing vain, the mental preparation for whatever mood he might encounter in the Empress. Tonight, as he adjusts the emerald pin and checks his reflection in a polished mirror, Poniatowski allows himself a moment of honest self-reflection. He has traded his freedom for security, his independence for influence, his future for the intoxicating proximity to absolute power. The bargain has brought him wealth, status, and access to one of the most fascinating women of his age. But it has also left him suspended between worlds, too elevated to return to his former life, too dependent to forge a new one. A soft knock at his door interrupts these melancholy thoughts. Catherine's personal servant stands in the corridor, bearing the familiar summons to the Empress's chambers. Poniatowski straightens his shoulders, adjusts his expression to one of pleasant anticipation, and follows the servant through the palace corridors. As they walk through the endless succession of rooms, past portraits of long-dead Tsars and tapestries depicting ancient victories, Poniatowski reflects on the peculiar nature of his imprisonment. Unlike the political prisoners who languish in the fortress of Peter and Paul, he is confined by luxury, held captive by affection, trapped by the very privileges that others might envy. The servant stops before the familiar door, bows slightly, and withdraws. Poniatowski takes a deep breath, composes his features, and enters the room where Catherine waits. She turns as he enters, and her face lights with what appears to be genuine pleasure at his arrival. For a moment, he can almost forget the complexities of their situation and simply enjoy the warmth of her welcome. But as the evening progresses, as they settle into the comfortable rhythm of conversation and companionship, Poniatowski remains aware of the invisible chains that bind him to this place, to this woman, to this life that is both everything he ever dreamed of and nothing he would have chosen for himself. Verse 3. The Heian court, love letters in the moonlight. The autumn of 1008 settles over the imperial capital of Heian Kyo, like a silk screen painted with maple leaves. In the shadowed corridors of the Fujiwara mansion, where the scent of incense mingles with the sound of rustling silk, Minamoto no Yorimune moves through the pre-dawn darkness with the careful silence of someone who has learned to make himself invisible. At 24, Yorimune possesses the kind of refined beauty that the court poets celebrate in their verses: pale skin that seems to glow in moonlight, long black hair that falls past his shoulders like a waterfall of night, hands that hold a brush with the delicate precision of a master calligrapher. But tonight, as he makes his way through the maze of sliding doors and covered walkways that connect the women's quarters to the main house, he carries with him the weight of a secret that could destroy everything he has built. The letter in his sleeve is written on paper the color of dawn clouds, scented with the subtle fragrance of cherry blossoms that Lady Murasaki favors. The calligraphy is his own characters that flow like water, each stroke placed with the careful attention that marks a man educated in the finest traditions of the court. But the words themselves are dangerous, speaking of feelings that should remain hidden, of desires that challenge the careful order of Heian society. Yorimune's position in the Fujiwara household is both privileged and precarious. He is what the court calls a companion, a young man of good birth but limited fortune who has attached himself to one of the great families, trading his wit, his beauty, and his absolute discretion for a place in the most sophisticated society in the world. His rooms are small but elegant, furnished with the understated luxury that marks true aristocratic taste. His clothing is of the finest silk, his food prepared by the same cooks who serve the family. His days are filled with poetry, music, and the intricate social rituals that define court life. But his nights belong to Lady Murasaki, the young widow who has become the unofficial head of the household since her husband's death 3 years ago. She is 31, 8 years his senior, possessed of the kind of intelligence and cultural refinement that makes her one of the most respected women at court. Her poetry circulates among the most discerning readers. Her opinions on matters of taste and protocol are sought by ladies who outrank her in birth, but defer to her in matters of style. The relationship had begun, as these things often do, with poetry. Yorimune had been commissioned to help organize a poetry competition for the cherry blossom viewing, and Lady Murasaki had been chosen as one of the judges. Their conversations about verse structure and seasonal imagery had gradually evolved into something more personal. She had praised his calligraphy. He had complimented her literary insights. Small gifts had been exchanged: a perfectly chosen fan, a piece of incense with an unusual fragrance, a book of Chinese poetry with certain passages marked for particular attention. The first letter had arrived on a morning when the garden was heavy with dew and the sound of temple bells drifted across the city. Lady Murasaki had written asking for his opinion on a poem she was composing for the autumn festival. But beneath the literary discussion, he had sensed something else, a loneliness that matched his own, a yearning for connection that transcended the formal boundaries of their relationship. His response had been carefully crafted, addressing her literary questions while allowing himself to hint at deeper feelings. He had written of the beauty of autumn mornings, of the way certain moments seem to hold all the world's sadness and joy in perfect balance. He had not spoken directly of love, but the implications had been clear to anyone educated in the subtle language of court correspondence. The exchange had continued through the changing seasons, each letter more intimate than the last. They had written of their dreams, their fears, their thoughts on the nature of beauty and impermanence. Lady Murasaki had shared her struggles with the loneliness of widowhood, the pressure to remarry, the challenge of maintaining her position in a society that valued women primarily for their connections to men. Euramune had written of his own uncertainties, his dependence on the favor of others, his fear that his youth and beauty were his only assets in a world that prized substance over appearance. But always, beneath the intellectual and emotional intimacy, had run the current of physical attraction. Lady Murasaki's letters had grown more personal, describing her sleepless nights, her dreams of companionship, her longing for touch. Euramune had responded with equal honesty, writing of his desire to comfort her, to share her burdens, to offer whatever solace he could provide. The first night they had spent together had been in early summer, when the air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming flowers and the sound of crickets filled the gardens. Lady Murasaki had summoned him to her chambers under the pretext of discussing arrangements for a poetry reading. But when he had arrived, he had found her alone, dressed in a robe of pale blue silk that seemed to float around her like mist. Their physical relationship had developed with the same careful attention to nuance that characterized their correspondence. Lady Murasaki approached intimacy with the same aesthetic sensibility she brought to poetry, every gesture considered, every moment crafted for maximum beauty and meaning. She had taught him to appreciate the subtle pleasures of delayed gratification, the way anticipation could enhance eventual fulfillment. But even in their most private moments, Euramune remained aware of the dangerous nature of their relationship. Lady Murasaki was not free to love as she chose. Her family expected her to remarry, preferably to someone who could enhance their political position. Her children from her first marriage would inherit titles and property that must be carefully managed. Her reputation, once damaged, could never be fully restored. And Euramune himself walked a precarious line. His position in the household depended on maintaining the fiction that he was simply a cultural companion, a young man whose presence enhanced the family's reputation for sophistication. If their relationship became known, he would be dismissed immediately, his reputation destroyed, his future in court society eliminated. The discretion required was exhausting. They could never be seen together, except in the company of others. Their meetings had to be carefully orchestrated, with reliable servants posted to watch for unexpected visitors. Their correspondence had to be conducted through intermediaries, with coded language that could be explained as purely literary if intercepted. But perhaps most challenging was the emotional discretion required. Euramune had to school his expression whenever Lady Murasaki appeared in public, showing no sign of the intimate knowledge he possessed. He had to watch her interact with potential suitors, had to listen to discussions of her remarriage plans, had to maintain the appearance of indifference while his heart raced with jealousy and fear. The social gatherings were the worst. During the elaborate parties that marked the changing seasons, Yoramune would sit in his assigned place, usually among the other young men of lesser rank, while Lady Murasaki presided over the women's section. He would catch glimpses of her through the decorative screens that separated the sexes, would hear her laughter or her voice raised in appreciation of a particularly fine poem. But he could not approach her, could not seek her attention, could not let his eyes linger on her face for more than a moment. The poetry competitions were particularly torturous. These gatherings, which should have been pure pleasure for someone of his literary interests, became exercises in emotional control. He would be expected to compose verses on assigned themes, often related to love or beauty, while sitting within sight of the woman who inspired his deepest feelings. The irony was not lost on him. He was creating art about emotions he could not openly express, performing passion while concealing the real passion that consumed him. Yet there were compensations. The letters continued, growing more sophisticated and more intimate as the months passed. Lady Murasaki had begun to share her own creative work with him, showing him drafts of the stories she was writing about court life. Her tales revealed a keen understanding of human nature, a compassion for the struggles of women trapped by social expectations, an appreciation for the beauty that could emerge from even the most constrained circumstances. In return, Yoramune had begun to write not just letters, but longer pieces, philosophical reflections on the nature of love, descriptions of the changing seasons that contained coded messages about his feelings, character sketches of court figures that revealed his growing understanding of the complex social world he inhabited. Their intellectual partnership had become as important as their emotional connection. Lady Murasaki valued his opinions on her writing, sought his advice on matters of style and structure. He had become her literary confidant, the one person with whom she could share her creative struggles and triumphs. In a world where women's intellectual achievements were often dismissed or ignored, Yoramune offered genuine appreciation for her talents. But always, beneath the literary collaboration and the emotional intimacy, ran the current of uncertainty. How long could such a relationship continue? Lady Murasaki was under increasing pressure to remarry, and each passing month brought new suitors, new proposals, new discussions of advantageous alliances. Her family's patience with her independence was not infinite, and Yoramune himself was growing older, his boyish beauty gradually giving way to the more settled features of maturity. In a court that prized youth and novelty, he knew that his value as a companion would inevitably decline. New young men would arrive, fresh from the provinces, eager to trade their beauty and talent for a place in sophisticated society. The letter he carries tonight represents a crisis point in their relationship. Lady Murasaki has received a proposal from a powerful court official, a man whose offer cannot be easily dismissed. She has written asking for Yoramune's advice, but beneath the formal language of her request, he can read her real question. What future can they have together? What alternative can he offer to the security and status that marriage would provide? As he reaches the entrance to her chambers, Yoramune pauses to compose himself. The dawn is still hours away, but already he can hear the distant sound of temple bells marking the passing of another night. In a few hours, the household will awaken, and he will once again assume the role of the cultured companion, the young man whose presence enhances the family's reputation while making no demands of his own. But for now, in the soft darkness before dawn, he has these stolen hours with the woman who has become both his greatest joy and his deepest source of anxiety. He slides open the door with practiced silence and steps into the room where Lady Murasaki waits, her figure silhouetted against the pale glow of a single candle. She turns as he enters, and her face shows the same mixture of pleasure and apprehension that he feels. They are both aware that their relationship has reached a crossroads, that the decisions made in the coming weeks will determine whether their love story ends in separation or scandal. But for tonight, they have these precious hours together, time to share their fears and hopes. to find comfort in each other's presence, to create another chapter in the secret history they have been writing together in letters and whispered conversations and stolen embraces. Verse 4. The rivals lament through envious eyes. The morning sun filters through the tall windows of the Château de Fontainebleau, casting long shadows across the marble floor where Henry de Montmorency paces with the restless energy of a caged wolf. It is the spring of 1547, and the court of Henry II buzzes with the usual intrigues and whispered conversations that follow power like moths drawn to flame. But today, Henry de Montmorency's attention is focused on a single figure moving through the royal apartments with the easy confidence of someone who has never known rejection. Jean-Baptiste de Villeroy is 22, possessed of a kind of golden beauty that seems to have been crafted by angels specifically to torment lesser mortals. His hair catches the light like spun gold. His eyes hold the deep blue of summer skies, and his smile carries the unconscious cruelty of someone who has never had to question his own worth. As he passes through the corridor, courtiers turn to watch him, their expressions ranging from admiration to barely concealed envy. But it is not the courtiers' attention that matters to Villeroy. His destination is the private chambers of Catherine de' Medici, the Dowager Queen, whose favor has elevated him from provincial obscurity to a position of influence that men twice his age and 3 times his experience might envy. And it is this very favor that eats at Henry de Montmorency's soul like acid, consuming him with a jealousy that has transformed from initial disappointment into something approaching hatred. Montmorency remembers the day Villeroy first appeared at court, a young man from Normandy whose family had sent him to Paris with little more than a letter of introduction and a purse barely sufficient for a month's lodging. He had been beautiful then, certainly, but raw, unpolished, wearing his provincial origins like an ill-fitting coat. The sophisticated courtiers had smiled at his awkwardness, had whispered behind fans about his unfamiliarity with court etiquette, had placed bets on how long he would last before retreating to his family's modest estates. Montmorency himself had been among those who initially dismissed the young provincial. At 35, he possessed the kind of worldly sophistication that came from 15 years at court, from service in diplomatic missions, from a carefully cultivated reputation as a man of letters and refined tastes. He had been among Catherine's circle for 3 years, had worked carefully to establish himself as indispensable to the Dowager Queen's network of informants and advisors. The position had not been easy to achieve. Catherine de' Medici was known for her intelligence, her political acumen, and her ability to see through flattery to the motives beneath. She surrounded herself with people who could provide useful information, who could carry out delicate missions, who could be trusted with secrets that could topple governments. Montmorency had proven himself valuable in all these areas, had become one of the small circle of men and women who had genuine access to the Dowager Queen's confidence. But that confidence, Montmorency now realized, had been built on his usefulness rather than any deeper connection. Catherine had appreciated his reports from the diplomatic missions, had valued his insights into court politics, had found him a competent and reliable agent. But she had never looked at him with anything approaching the warmth she now reserved for Villeroy. The transformation had begun subtly. Villeroy had been invited to join the literary salon that Catherine hosted twice weekly, where poets and scholars gathered to discuss the latest works from Italy and France. Initially, he had said little, content to listen and learn. But gradually, as his confidence grew, he had begun to contribute his own observations, revealing a natural wit and an intuitive understanding of human nature that impressed even the most jaded courtiers. Montmorency had watched this transformation with growing unease. He had seen Villeroy's provincial awkwardness give way to polished sophistication, had observed how the young man learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of court life. More troubling, he had watched Catherine's interest in Villeroy grow from mild curiosity to obvious fascination. The first sign of genuine favor had come when Catherine had requested that. Villeroy accompanied her to a private viewing of some new paintings she had acquired from Florence. The honor was significant. Such invitations were extended only to those in whom the Dowager Queen had particular confidence. Montmorency had felt a stab of jealousy then, but had consoled himself with the thought that Catherine's interest was likely temporary, that Villeroy's novelty would eventually wear off. But the invitations had continued and gradually expanded. Villeroy had been asked to join Catherine for intimate dinners, to accompany her on morning walks through the palace gardens, to serve as her partner in games of cards and chess. Each new mark of favor had been like a knife thrust to Montmorency's pride, confirmation that his own position was being steadily eroded by this golden interloper. The worst part was that Villeroy seemed genuinely unaware of the damage he was causing. He treated Montmorency with the same friendly courtesy he showed to all the other courtiers, apparently oblivious to the jealousy his presence inspired. When they found themselves at the same gatherings, he would greet Montmorency warmly, would inquire about his health and his family, would even seek his advice on matters of court protocol. This apparent innocence only made Montmorency's hatred burn brighter. He found himself studying Villeroy with the intensity of a general studying an enemy's defenses, looking for weaknesses that might be exploited, for flaws that might be revealed. He listened to every conversation the young man had, analyzed every interaction with Catherine, searched for signs that the Dowager Queen's favor might be wavering. But such signs were frustratingly absent. If anything, Catherine's affection for Villeroy seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. She had begun to seek his opinion on matters of policy, to include him in discussions of political strategy, to treat him as a confidant rather than merely a companion. The transformation was complete when she had given him apartments in the palace itself, rooms that were larger and more luxuriously appointed than those occupied by men of much higher rank. The physical relationship between Catherine and Villeroy was never acknowledged openly, but its existence was obvious to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signs of court life. The way Catherine's eyes followed Villeroy when he moved through a room, the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, the way she would find excuses to touch his hand or his arm during their conversations, the way they would disappear together for long periods, returning with the satisfied air of people who had found exactly what they were looking for. Montmorency found himself tormented by images of their intimacy. He would lie awake at night, imagining Catherine's hands on Villeroy's golden skin, picturing the young man's head on her pillow, envisioning the whispered conversations that followed their lovemaking. The thought of Catherine offering to Villeroy the tenderness and vulnerability that she had never shown to him was almost unbearable. But perhaps even more galling was the way Villeroy had begun to wield his influence. The young man who had arrived at court with nothing but his beauty and his charm had become one of the most powerful people in France. Catherine consulted him on appointments to important positions, sought his advice on matters of foreign policy, trusted him with secrets that could reshape the balance of power in Europe. Montmorency watched in bitter frustration as Villeroy used his position to advance his own interests and those of his family. Lucrative positions appeared for his relatives. His friends found themselves appointed to prestigious posts. His recommendations carried weight with ministers and ambassadors. The provincial boy who had once begged for an introduction to court society now held the power to make or break careers with a word in the right ear. The injustice of it consumed Montmorency's thoughts. He had worked for years to build his reputation, to prove his worth, to earn a position of influence through merit and dedication. Villeroy had achieved more in 2 years through the accident of his beauty and the fortune of Catherine's favor than Montmorency had managed in a lifetime of service. Worse still was the knowledge that his own position was becoming increasingly precarious. Catherine's attention had shifted so completely to Villeroy that she barely seemed to notice Montmorency's presence. The reports he submitted were received with polite acknowledgement but little interest. The advice he offered was listened to with obvious impatience. The access he had once taken for granted was being gradually withdrawn. He had tried to adapt, to find ways to make himself useful to the new regime. He had attempted to cultivate Villeroy's friendship, thinking that perhaps he could maintain his position by becoming allied with Catherine's new favorite. But Villeroy, despite his apparent friendliness, had shown no inclination to share his influence or to rely on Montmorency's counsel. The final humiliation had come the previous week, when Montmorency had been excluded from a crucial meeting about relations with Spain. The discussion had included all of Catherine's closest advisors, except for him. When he had asked Villeroy about the meeting later, the young man had given him a vague smile and said that Catherine had felt the gathering should be kept small. The dismissal had been polite but unmistakable. Now, as Montmorency watches Villeroy move through the palace corridors with the easy confidence of someone who has never known rejection, he feels the full weight of his own failure. He has been replaced, superseded, rendered obsolete by someone younger, more beautiful, more appealing to the woman whose favor had once meant everything to him. The tragedy is not just professional, but personal. Montmorency has come to realize that his feelings for Catherine ran deeper than mere ambition or career advancement. He had genuinely cared for her, had hoped that his years of faithful service might eventually be rewarded with something approaching affection. The discovery that she was capable of the kind of passion she showed for Villeroy, a passion that would never be directed toward him, had revealed the poverty of his own emotional life. He thinks of the letters he has written but never sent, the declarations of feeling that remain hidden in his private papers. He remembers the gifts he had chosen so carefully, hoping to please her, and the way she had received them with polite gratitude, but no real warmth. He recalls the moments when he had thought he detected genuine affection in her voice, only to realize later that he had been reading his own desires into her words. The comparison with Villeroy is devastating. Where Montmorency had to work to earn Catherine's attention, Villeroy commanded it effortlessly. Where Montmorency had to prove his worth through service and dedication, Villeroy had proven his simply by existing. Where Montmorency had to beg for scraps of favor, Villeroy was offered the full feast of Catherine's affection. As he watches Villeroy disappear into Catherine's private apartments, Montmorency feels something die within him. Not hope that had been extinguished months ago, but rather the last vestiges of his self-respect. He has been reduced to the role of bitter observer, watching from the sidelines as someone else lives the life he had dreamed of for himself. The future stretches before him like a wasteland. He is too old to start over, too proud to accept a diminished role, too intelligent not to understand exactly what has happened to him. He will continue to attend court functions, to smile and bow and pretend that nothing has changed. But he will do so with the knowledge that he has been weighed in the balance and found wanting, that his years of service and devotion have been rendered meaningless by the accident of another man's beauty. The morning sun continues to shine through the palace windows, but for Henry de Montmorency, it illuminates only the ruins of his ambitions and the bitter truth that in the game of love and power, merit is no match for the cruel lottery of physical attraction and personal chemistry. Conclusion. As the centuries drift past us like autumn leaves on a quiet stream, we find ourselves returning to the present moment, to the soft darkness of your room, to the gentle rhythm of your breathing. The stories of these men, Alexios in his Roman garden, Poniatowski in his gilded cage, Urmune with his hidden letters, Montmorency with his bitter observations, fade into the comfortable distance of history, but their echoes remain. What have we learned from these shadows of the past? Perhaps that the human heart, in all its complexity, remains remarkably constant across the centuries. The needs that drove these men for security, for affection, for recognition, for belonging, are the same needs that shape our own lives today. The compromises they made, the prices they paid, the joys they found, and the sorrows they endured speak to something timeless in the human experience. We have seen how love and power intertwine in ways both beautiful and destructive, how dependency can be both refuge and prison, how the search for connection can lead to both fulfillment and heartbreak. These men existed in the spaces between social categories, in the margins of conventional relationships, in the shadows cast by more powerful figures. Yet their stories remind us that even in the shadows, human experience retains its full complexity and dignity. The kept man, the favored companion, the cherished dependent, these roles still exist in our world, though they may take different forms. The fundamental dynamics remain: the dance between affection and calculation, the tension between gratitude and resentment, the delicate balance between giving and receiving that defines all human relationships. But perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that history is not just the province of kings and queens, of generals and politicians, of those who wielded obvious power. It is also the story of those who lived in the spaces between, who found ways to survive and even flourish in circumstances that others might have found impossible. As you settle deeper into sleep, let these stories become part of your dreams. Let yourself drift back to that Roman garden where Alexios tends his herbs in the morning sun, to that Russian palace where Poniatowski adjusts his emerald pin, to that Japanese mansion where Euroimmun composes his careful letters, to that French chateau where Montmorency wrestles with his bitter jealousy. Rest now, knowing that throughout history, people have found ways to love and be loved, to create meaning and beauty, even in the most constrained circumstances, to endure and adapt, and sometimes even triumph over the limitations that life imposed upon them. The past is quiet now, its stories told, its lessons offered. Sleep well, and let the gentle weight of history settle over you like a comfortable blanket, warm and soft and infinitely reassuring. In the morning, these stories will remain part of the vast tapestry of human experience that connects us all across the centuries. Good night.